Hello, welcome to Author Spotlight for the month of January. I'm Patty Pellikka, Editor-in-Chief of Journal of the American Society of Echocardiography. It's great that I'm joined today by Dr. Thomas Marwick from Australia. Professor Marwick really needs no introduction. He is a clinician scientist and has advanced understanding of echocardiography, stress testing, and really so much in the field of cardiology. He has contributed a great paper. Welcome, Tom.
Thanks, Patty. It's lovely being here. Nice to see you.
Tom's paper is about cardiac function and functional capacity in patients with long COVID. And tell us what inspired you to do this project, Tom.
Yeah, thanks, Patty. We're fascinated by the evolution of understanding of cardiac involvement in COVID. Right in the beginning of the pandemic, I'm sure you remember the papers that came out saying that there was a 70% or more involvement of the myocardium. And we were intrigued by that. It wasn't our experience, although in Australia we had a different experience of COVID from Europe and the US. And we have been working in that space and then particularly wondering about how that interfaced with this phenomenon of long COVID. So this is not a very well-defined condition, but I think, we all see it, people that have ongoing symptoms after COVID, many of them cardiac. And so we wondered whether this myocardial involvement that's seen in acute COVID could be related to the long COVID findings. And the bottom line really is that there are some changes of myocardial function, but these changes are very weakly associated with reduction of functional capacity in these people with long COVID. So overall, a negative finding, but some interesting observations about cardiac function in the COVID population I'd be happy to discuss further.
It is really interesting. You assembled a group of 190 patients with long COVID and then controls that were from the same community, and then did comprehensive echocardiographic assessment in these patients and evaluated their impairment with the Duke Activity Status Index, as well as a 6-minute walk test. So what did you find?
Yeah, so this, just to give a little bit of background about the control group, our group, as you probably know, have a long-term interest in subclinical dysfunction as a predictor of the development of heart failure. And we've had various surveillance populations in Tasmania and Victoria over the last decade or so. So these are people, who are getting towards heart failure age, sort of middle age, 60 plus and older, where we've gone to the community and we've looked for changes in myocardial strain and so on. And so what we did is to take those people pre-COVID and compared them in the same community with people that had COVID. So we know that the control population could not have had COVID because it was a pre-COVID era. So what we found is that as you'd expect in the general population with elderly people with risk factors, there are a proportion of people who have got abnormal strain and abnormal diastolic function. And it depends exactly how you cut the population, but it's usually between sort of 10 and 15%. In the post-COVID population, we found changes, particularly of global longitudinal strain, that were more frequent, probably about 10% more frequent than in the general population. Intriguingly, there was no difference in diastolic function. They were just the same, and basically the diastolic parameters seem to track the underlying risk factors, which is what we'd expect. Now, we were puzzled by this, of course. We, often I think as clinicians, we think of myocardial disease as having multiple faces. Usually you'd expect to see systolic change and diastolic change together, but it doesn't always happen like that. In particular, we over the years have had an interest in diabetes, and in the diabetic population, there are quite separate phenotypes of people that have selective change of strain, systolic strain, and really not significant change of diastolic function, and the opposite. So we were intrigued that we're seeing the same thing in the long COVID population. We think that this is probably a metabolic message about the underlying risk of COVID and long COVID in people with cardiometabolic disease.
Super interesting. Yeah, I certainly would have thought we would have seen something with the diastolic function along with the global longitudinal strain, but the changes were fairly minor.
Yeah, they were. And again, I think we would have been more anxious about this had we not seen this signal in the diabetic population previously. And I think that, of course, this is an ongoing area of investigation for us about the exact mechanism, but I think that maybe metabolic disturbances can have a direct effect on the myocyte and therefore on systolic function without necessarily involving the interstitium. Obviously people in later stage disease have interstitial disease and therefore more diastolic involvement. Maybe that's a simplistic interpretation, but that's where we are with this at the moment.
Any final words for our readers about your work?
Well, the thing that was really, I think, unique about this, there have been previous smaller studies about myocardial involvement in long COVID. But the thing that we had from the controls and in this population is that we measured exercise capacity subjectively, as I said, using JASE, and objectively using 6-minute walk. And in people with long COVID, I'm sure, clinicians who are watching this will recognize that, fatigue and reduced functional capacity is a common feature. And indeed, we saw it in this population, but very poor association, like an R value of 0.2 with the reduction of GLS. So there's multiple drivers of this. And indeed, long COVID is probably a whole cluster of diseases. We look upon it, clinically as an entity, but it probably is multiple entities. But I guess the clinical message I took from this and the frequency of the abnormal GLS is not necessarily that the COVID is the culprit, but in these people that have long COVID, that cardiometabolic disease is important. Even though we went through the process of matching, with a propensity score with our control group, people with long COVID more commonly have cardiometabolic disease. And I think that is the most likely driver of their abnormal strain. Maybe they have myocarditis or scarring as a result as well, but the diastolic parameters don't support.
Thanks for joining me, Tom, and thank you for publishing in JASE.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Nice to see you again, Betty.